Nobody in that studio said a word. Not Johnny Carson, who had interviewed presidents, movie legends, and the most famous human beings alive, and who was now sitting completely motionless behind his desk, his coffee cup frozen halfway to his lips. Not the studio band, whose instruments had gone quiet without a conductor's signal, as if the musicians themselves understood that sound had no place in this moment. Not the 400 people packed into the NBC studio in Burbank, California, on the night of November 18, 1971. Not one of them shifted in their seat, cleared their throat, or exhaled above a whisper. George Harrison's finger was still pointing. He had leaned forward from his chair with the quiet intensity of a man who had made a decision and was not going to walk it back. His eyes were fixed on Clint Eastwood, the most dangerous-looking man in American cinema, the star of Dirty Harry, a man whose on-screen silence alone could make an entire audience hold its breath. Harrison's finger pointed directly at him, not gesturing, not indicating, accusing. The words had already left his mouth, calm and sharp as a blade laid flat on a table. If you truly believe you take the guitar seriously, Clint, then pick it up, right now, on this stage, in front of all these people. Play something real. For a moment, no one moved. Eastwood did not flinch. He did not reach for a joke. He did not look at Carson for rescue or at the audience for sympathy. He looked at Harrison with that same flat, unreadable expression that had made millions of moviegoers nervous in darkened theaters across America. And then, very slowly, he looked down at the guitar case resting beside his chair. The vintage Martin D28, the one he had carried in himself, the one everyone in that studio had assumed was a prop, a costume piece, a decoration for the image of a rugged man who appreciated simple things. His jaw tightened once. His hand moved toward the latch. 7 seconds passed. The clock on the studio wall did not lie. 7 full seconds of silence, so complete that the hum of the overhead studio lights became audible. A low electric drone filling the space where music and laughter had been just moments before. In the front row, a woman in a red dress slowly raised her hand to cover her mouth. Carson set his coffee cup down with the careful precision of a man trying not to disturb something fragile. And then Clint Eastwood opened the case. What nobody in that room could have known, what even George Harrison, the man who had spent 20 years living inside music and breathing it like air, could not have known, was that the instrument inside that case had not spent its life on a shelf or in a prop room. It had been played, deeply, privately, for years, in hotel rooms and film locations and quiet mornings before the rest of the world woke up. And the man about to pick it up had learned things on it that he had never told a single journalist, a single interviewer, or a single person in his industry. But that moment didn't start there. If you want to understand what happened in those 7 seconds, and what it meant for both of these men, you have to go back to where this night truly began. And it didn't begin in that studio. Subscribe and keep watching, because what Clint played next left George Harrison completely speechless, and that almost never happened to anyone. By the autumn of 1971, George Harrison was carrying something heavy. The Beatles had been officially dead for less than a year, and the world was still treating the wound like it was fresh. Every interviewer, every journalist, every stranger with a microphone wanted to talk about John, about Paul, about whether the 4 of them would ever walk back into a room together. Nobody wanted to talk about George. Not really. Not about the man himself, about what he had built alone. About the fact that just 3 months earlier, on August 1st at Madison Square Garden, he had organized the first major humanitarian rock concert in history. The Concert for Bangladesh, pulling together Bob Dylan, Eric Clapton, Ringo Starr, and Ravi Shankar for a cause the rest of the music world hadn't even noticed yet. He had done something genuinely historic, and the first question in every interview was still, "So, do you miss the Beatles?" He was 38 years old in his soul and exhausted in a way that fame cannot fix. Harrison had also spent enough time around music to develop a specific impatience, the kind that only comes from mastery. He had learned slide guitar from Duane Allman. He had sat at the feet of Ravi Shankar and studied sitar for years, not as a curiosity, not as an accessory to his image, but with the discipline of a serious student. He understood what it cost to truly learn an instrument, what years of private struggle looked like, what the difference was between a man who played and a man who had paid for it with his time and his silence. That distinction mattered to him more than almost anything, which is why when he arrived at the NBC studio that November evening and watched Clint Eastwood walk in carrying a guitar case and then set it in the corner without opening it, the way a man sets down a briefcase, without ceremony, without attention, something in Harrison's chest went still and cold. He watched Eastwood pour himself a coffee, watched him read the newspaper, watched him treat that case like luggage. And in the green room, Harrison quietly asked a production assistant 4 words. "Does he actually play?" The assistant shrugged. "I think so. For fun." For fun. Those 2 words would change everything that happened next. The producers of The Tonight Show had not planned for any of this. The booking was simple on paper. George Harrison was the musical guest. He would perform, answer a few questions about Bangladesh, deflect the inevitable Beatles reunion question with his usual quiet firmness, and leave. Clint Eastwood was the interview guest. He was promoting Dirty Harry, which was set to open on December 23rd, and which early screenings suggested was going to be the most talked-about film of the year. 2 separate segments, 2 separate conversations. No overlap, no interaction, no reason for these 2 men to be in the same sentence. But television has a way of collapsing careful plans. Midway through the pre-show production meeting, one of the segment producers noticed something. Both guests were already in the building at the same time. Both had expressed willingness to extend their segments, and the scheduled comedian for the 3rd slot had canceled that afternoon with a throat infection. There was a gap. And gaps on live television are the one thing producers fear more than conflict. So, someone made a call. Both guests would share the couch. It would be casual, easy, 2 legends in a room together. What could possibly go wrong? What they did not account for was Harrison's mood. He had done 3 interviews earlier that day. 3 separate rooms, 3 separate journalists, and in all 3, the conversation had never once reached the music he was actually making. It had orbited the Beatles like a moon that couldn't escape gravity. By the time he settled into his chair on the Tonight Show set and the studio lights came up warm and gold around him, there was a tiredness behind his eyes that the makeup couldn't cover. He was present, professional, polite, but underneath he was somewhere else entirely. Then Carson, doing what Carson did better than any host alive, leaned across his desk with that easy Midwestern smile and nodded toward the guitar case Eastwood had brought on stage. "I hear you pick it up every now and then, Clint." Eastwood smiled slightly. "Now and then." Harrison's eyes moved to the case, then to Eastwood's hands, then back to the case. Something shifted in his expression. Quiet, measuring, the way a man looks when he has already started asking a question he hasn't spoken yet. If this story is pulling you in, subscribe now, because the next 60 seconds on that stage will be something neither of these men ever forgot. What does now and then mean exactly? Harrison's voice was calm. That was the thing people who were there that night remembered most clearly afterward. Not the words, but how quiet they were. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't performing anger for the audience. He leaned forward in his chair with his elbows on his knees and asked the question the way a man asks something he genuinely wants answered, which made it more unsettling than any raised voice could have been. "Because in my experience," Harrison continued, his eyes fixed on Eastwood, "guitar is either something you give yourself to completely, or it's something you carry around because it looks good. And I can't always tell which one I'm looking at from across the room." The audience didn't laugh. Nobody had signaled them that this was supposed to be funny. Eastwood looked at Harrison for a long moment. Not defensive, not embarrassed, just looking, the way he looked at things, with the full, unhurried attention of a man who had never once in his life felt the need to fill silence with noise. "I play," he said simply. "I've always played." Harrison nodded slowly, as if he were filing that answer somewhere and hadn't decided yet what to do with it. Then he sat back, glanced once at the guitar case and said the words that stopped the room. "Then pick it up, right now, on this stage, in front of all these people. Play something real, not 3 chords, not a melody you learned last weekend. Something that shows you've actually lived inside this instrument. If you mean it when you say you play, then mean it right now." For a moment, no one moved. Carson's hand was flat on his desk. The studio band had stopped mid-breath. 400 people sat in the kind of silence that only arrives when something real and unscripted has just entered the room, and everyone present understands simultaneously that they are no longer watching a television program. They are watching 2 men tell each other the truth in public, which is one of the rarest things in the world. Eastwood didn't look at the audience, didn't look at Carson. He looked at the guitar case, and something moved across his face. Not anger, not nerves, but something older and quieter than either. Recognition. Like a man who has just been called by his real name after years of answering to another one. His hand moved to the latch. 1 second. 2. 3. 4. 5. 6. Carson opened his mouth to speak, to rescue the moment, to soften it, to do what hosts do when the air gets too sharp. 7. Eastwood's hand opened the case, reached inside and lifted out the Martin D28 with the ease of a man picking up something he had held 10,000 times before, because he had. The frets were grooved, the wood around the sound hole was worn smooth. This was not a prop. This had never been a prop. He settled the guitar across his knee, looked down at his left hand finding its position on the neck, and without a word, without a glance at Harrison or Carson or the 400 people holding their breath in the dark, he began to play. It was not what anyone expected, not a simple melody, not 3 careful chords chosen to satisfy the challenge without risking failure. What came out of that worn Martin D28 was a finger-picked blues progression rooted in the Piedmont tradition, the intricate, interlocking style that had been born in the Carolinas and Virginia in the 1920s and carried north and west through decades of quiet rooms and late nights, and men playing alone because the music demanded it. Eastwood's right thumb walked a steady bass line across the lower strings, while his fingers pulled melody notes from the upper ones simultaneously. 2 voices from one instrument, the way the old masters had done it, the way you could only do it after years of sitting alone with a guitar and nothing else to prove to anyone. The audience didn't applaud. They listened. That was the thing that stunned the crew members watching from the wings, the thing that the band leader, Skitch Henderson, would describe to colleagues for years afterward. The audience did not make a single sound. They had come to laugh and be entertained and go home. And instead they were sitting in the dark listening to Clint Eastwood play blues guitar with their hands folded in their laps like people in a church who have just realized the sermon is actually true. Harrison's pointing finger had lowered somewhere in the first 15 seconds. He couldn't have said exactly when. He became aware of it gradually, the way you become aware that you've stopped breathing, not at the moment it happens, but a few seconds after, when the body quietly insists on being noticed. He was leaning forward still, but differently now, not with challenge, with attention. His head tilted slightly to the right, the way musicians tilt when they are trying to hear inside something, to locate the structure underneath the sound, to understand not just what is being played, but how and why, and at what cost. He heard the cost. It was in every note. There is a quality to music that has been learned in private, away from audiences, away from applause, away from anyone who might be impressed, that is almost impossible to fake and very easy to recognize if you have ever made that sacrifice yourself. It carries a different weight. It sits differently in the air. George Harrison had spent his entire life learning to hear that quality, and he was hearing it now, coming from a man he had publicly dismissed 60 seconds ago. His eyes changed. The judgment dissolved. What replaced it was the one thing George Harrison gave almost no one: respect. Don't go anywhere, because what Harrison said when the music finally stopped is the part of this story that was never supposed to be known. Eastwood lifted his hand from the strings after 90 seconds, not because he had finished, because he had said enough. The final note faded into the studio air and dissolved, and the silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one before he played. That one had been tension, held breath, the silence of people bracing for embarrassment. This one was the silence of people who had just received something they hadn't known they needed and didn't yet have words for. Then the audience came apart. Not the polite, rhythmic applause of a talk show, the uncontrolled, uncoordinated sound of 400 people reacting at different speeds because they were each processing something privately before the noise came out of them. Carson stood up. He didn't say anything. He just stood. Harrison waited until the room settled. Then he leaned forward, and in a voice quiet enough that Carson had to tilt toward him to hear, he said, "Where did you learn to do that?" Not a challenge, not a performance, a genuine question from a man who had just been genuinely surprised, which was perhaps the rarest thing George Harrison ever allowed himself to be in public. Eastwood told him the truth. Oakland. His father humming jazz in the kitchen during the Depression. The borrowed guitar at 14. The Bay Area clubs in his 20s where nobody knew his face and nobody cared, only whether his fingers could keep up. The hotel rooms on film locations at 2 in the morning, playing for no one, for years, because the music was simply there, and he needed it the way certain people need silence and others need noise. Harrison listened without interrupting. When Eastwood finished, Harrison said only this, "That's the only way it ever gets real." Nobody reported what happened after the cameras stopped. The crew broke down equipment. The audience filed out into the Burbank night. Carson shook both men's hands and disappeared into the hallway with his producers. And George Harrison sat in his chair for a long moment, guitar still across his lap, not moving, not speaking. The way a man sits when something has rearranged itself quietly inside him, and he needs a minute before he trusts himself to stand. Before Eastwood reached the exit, Harrison caught up with him. What he said in that hallway was heard by no one except the two of them. But 2 days later, Harrison placed a call to Eastwood's management with a simple request. Would Clint be willing to come to a small studio in Malibu? No engineers, no producers, no agenda. Just 2 guitars and an afternoon with nowhere else to be. Eastwood said yes. The session lasted 3 days. Nothing recorded there was ever released. Nobody outside of a handful of people even knew it happened. But people close to Harrison said he came back from those 3 days in Malibu different. Quieter, in a good way. Lighter, in a way that had nothing to do with happiness, and everything to do with having remembered something important. He had walked onto the Tonight Show stage that November evening, absolutely certain he knew what Clint Eastwood was. He had been wrong, in the most instructive way a person can be wrong. Not embarrassingly, but humbly, in a way that opened something rather than closed it. The greatest musicians are not always the ones the world has heard of. Some of them spend their lives in hotel rooms at 2 in the morning, playing for no audience, answering to nothing but the music itself. If this story reminded you never to underestimate the quiet ones, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And subscribe, because there are more stories like this one waiting for you right here.